Gurdjieff was teaching Ouspensky the first step on the stairway, the first stage in this transformation. And we can see a sequence of ideas recorded by Ouspensky in his book In Search of the Miraculous that indicate what Gurdjieff was actually teaching to him. First, Gurdjieff was teaching try-to exercises. Now, to give an example of one of these, Gurdjieff said try to observe yourself and gave instructions as to how to do this. And so the pupils are sent away to try self-observation. Now, Gurdjieff revealed later on in 1924 that the purpose of this, the reason for this, is to come to the realization that you can't do it. Indeed, this is the pattern established by all the try-to exercises that Gurdjieff gave to Ouspensky. In the case of self-observation, as one example of these, a specific example which we have recorded, then Gurdjieff said self-observation is very difficult. Do not try anything else. In the beginning, self-observation is enough. Do not try anything else. And the reason you are trying to observe yourself is because to come to the realization that you cannot do it. So in order to come to this realization, you must try and try and try to observe yourself. Now, this is true of all the try-to exercises such as try to remember yourself whilst you are observing yourself. Try to struggle with the habit. And what habit? The habit of immediately manifesting. And when do you immediately manifest? When you experience an unpleasant emotion. To try to exercise. And so on. So the pattern is first, pupils are given the try-to exercises. Self-observation is enough for several years. So this is not a superficial task. And you try these things to come to the realization that you can't do them. So this is the first stage of the first stage in this transformation. Now, why do you come to the realization that you can't do them? You come to this realization to ask why. Why can't I do it? Why can't I observe myself? And Gurdjieff's answer, and this is where the teachings differ. I've said there are two completely different teachings. This is where the teachings differ. Because Gurdjieff's answer is you can't observe yourself because we have fallen to a very low energetic level and have fallen internally into structures from which we cannot emerge. And these structures result as a consequence in an abnormal psychology. That is to say, a psychology in which we cannot observe ourselves. A psychology in which we cannot remember ourselves. A psychology in which we cannot even struggle with this habit of immediately manifesting when we experience an unpleasant emotion, and so on. So the series of try-to exercises are there to show that we have an abnormal psychology, which we then question. Why do we have an abnormal psychology? And Gurdjieff's answer is that we have fallen to such a low energetic level that we are trapped in internal structures from which we cannot emerge. Man the machine, not man the operator of the machine. Now, the Gurdjieff tradition has taken the try-to exercises as if they themselves are essentially the means by which we develop, and this is not correct. The try-to exercises are showing that we have an abnormal psychology. Why do we have an abnormal psychology? It's a consequence of a structural situation. The mechanics, man the machine. It's not a psychological truth that Gurdjieff is pointing out, although he is pointing out that we have an abnormal psychology. But he's speaking about the psychology to point back to the structural situation. So here it's possible to go very, very wrong in understanding Gurdjieff's teaching. And this leads, if you go wrong here, it leads to the Gurdjieff tradition, which says if you try and try and try to observe yourself, you will eventually be able to do it. If you try and try and try to remember yourself, you will eventually be able to do it. This is not what Gurdjieff was teaching. And so even at this first, shall we say, hurdle in Gurdjieff's teaching to Ouspensky, on the first part of this first step on the stairway, the Gurdjieff tradition goes wrong. And the teachers in the Gurdjieff tradition are completely wrong in what they are teaching. Gurdjieff was teaching man the machine. He said, let's look at the machine, not the operator of the machine. We're not looking at psychology. If we look at psychology, it is to point back to a structural situation. That is, there is something wrong with the machine. There's nothing wrong with us, even though we have an abnormal psychology. Because our abnormal psychology is our adaptation to the fact that there is something wrong with the machine. There's a structural problem. So Gurdjieff is pointing back to the structural situation. To give two examples of the obvious examples of this, first, we are three-centered or three-brain beings. This is emphasized again and again by Gurdjieff. This is the reason we can't observe ourselves. This is the reason we can't remember ourselves. We are trapped in this situation. We shouldn't be in this situation of being trapped in three centers. We should be distinct from the centers. The second structural situation Gurdjieff writes about, even though there's not a single word about this in the Gurdjieff tradition, we have two consciousnesses having nothing in common. We are living in the wrong one. Two conscious minds, it's a structural situation, and as a result of this, we are living in a false state of consciousness, a false state of consciousness. We're living in the wrong conscious mind, and this wrong conscious mind at such a low level, because of our energetic state, does not have a true state of consciousness. We do not have consciousness of self. We have instead a false state of consciousness because we're living in a false conscious mind known, let's say, as waking sleep. So we live in waking sleep, not consciousness of self, because of a structural situation. Now, we can't remedy these situations. We can't remedy the fact that we can't observe ourselves. We can't remedy the fact that we can't remember ourselves. We can't remedy the fact that we are living in a false state of consciousness instead of a true state of consciousness. We can't remedy these by psychological means, by efforts on our part. They're structural situations, and they're a consequence of the fact that we are living in a very low energetic state. So Gurdjieff is pointing out this structural situation with a view to we then have to undergo this transformation, an energetic process, raising the energetic level of the whole organism so that we can escape from these structures, so that we can observe ourselves, we can remember ourselves. We do have a true state of consciousness, consciousness of self, and so on, because we have the energies for these things. We can't do anything psychologically. This is quite clear in the book In Search of the Miraculous. We can't do anything. Gurdjieff said to Ouspensky, we can't do anything psychologically. You can't change anything. And yet, in my opinion, the Gurdjieff tradition is teaching that we can. So this is not actually Gurdjieff's teaching, although it is attributed incorrectly to him. So everything Gurdjieff was doing was pointing to the fact that we are trapped internally in structural situations from which we cannot emerge. We don't have the energies to do so. And his teaching is that we must create the energies. He makes this explicit in terms of the activity of self-remembering, which of course is a try-to task. We try to remember ourselves to eventually come to the realization that we can't do it. Why not? Because we're trapped in a structural situation. We're trapped in the structural situation of having three centers. We are trapped in the three centers. We shouldn't be trapped in the three centers. We should be distinct and independent of the three centers. But we don't have the energy for this. And Gurdjieff made this explicit in terms of self-remembering. He said we come to the conclusion, we come to the realization that we must remember ourselves. How do we come to this? By the try-to exercise. So we come to the realization that we must remember ourselves but we can remember ourselves only when we have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So he is not saying, go on trying and trying and trying to remember yourself. This is the Gurdjieff tradition, which is an incorrect interpretation of Gurdjieff's teaching. Gurdjieff instead is saying we come to the realization that we must remember ourselves, but we can remember ourselves only if we have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So we're looking at energies to raise us up out of the structural situations in which we are trapped. So this is Gurdjieff's teaching. And I think it's quite different from the teaching that is presented as if it is Gurdjieff's teaching, which I call the Gurdjieff tradition. The question of the pupil. You seem to be pointing out a contradiction between the Gurdjieff tradition, the teaching ascribed to Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff's actual teaching, as written down by him. This contradiction is that in the Gurdjieff tradition there is the idea that we can develop ourselves, we can develop during our lives by means of efforts on our part. And these efforts are primarily psychological efforts of attempts to observe ourselves, attempts to remember ourselves, to develop in ourselves consciousness of self. That is to say, they are psychological efforts, and our development is the development of our consciousness. This is the Gurdjieff tradition, the traditional teaching ascribed to Gurdjieff. But you seem to be saying that Gurdjieff in his writings says that the ordinary man or woman cannot develop in any way during the course of their lifetime. Any attempt to develop oneself does not work, and in fact only makes our situation worse because it disrupts the already established harmony established in us, this harmony established in us as ordinary men and women over time. So no development at all of the ordinary man or woman can take place during our lifetime. And you are saying that this is what Gurdjieff was teaching, and this is what Gurdjieff writes. Aren't these two positions contradictory? That's my question. The teacher replies, what you have said is correct, exactly right. There is a complete and total contradiction between the Gurdjieff tradition, the teaching ascribed to Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff's actual teaching. Gurdjieff's actual teaching is that no development of the ordinary man or woman is possible in any way during the course of their lives. And as Gurdjieff writes, any attempt to do so does not work and only makes our situation worse. Now, I can discern from your question that you are asking for evidence for this, or why Gurdjieff said this, or some sort of background theory to support my idea that this is what Gurdjieff is teaching. We can't develop in any way during the course of our lives. Any attempt to do so does not work and only makes our situation worse, and that therefore, as Gurdjieff is saying, a transformation is necessary before we can begin to develop. This is Gurdjieff's teaching. Now, to give an example that occurs early in Gurdjieff's actual teaching, at least as I present it, let's take the idea of stopping thoughts. We find this in Ouspensky's writings. We can find similar ideas in other writings and in Eastern philosophies. So it's a try-to task. Try to stop thoughts. Well, we're all fairly agile in terms of mental gymnastics. We can discern, we can devise, we can develop different ways of trying to do this, different ways of understanding this, and make sense of it over long periods of time. And we can even come to the belief that we're actually starting to achieve this by means of our efforts, by means of our work upon ourselves. But what Gurdjieff is actually pointing out is a very practical realization, and that is that we may, for a certain time, convince ourselves that we are actually achieving something in terms of stopping thoughts. But what happens then is that all of a sudden something comes back and hits us, and we find ourselves driven madly, insanely, uncontrollably, to even worse excesses of thoughts. We're overcome by a flood of thoughts, of thinking, incessant, insistent, uncontrollable by us. It comes back and hits us. Why? So we have the try to task, stop thoughts. It seems to work at first for a short while, but then it comes back and hits us, and we're actually in a worse situation. We find ourselves in a worse situation. So we can ask why. Let's take another example. We have a try to task. Ouspensky writes about daydreaming and imagination. How much time we waste, how much energies we waste, in inverted commas, on daydreaming and imagination. So we try to stop daydreaming and imagination. We can imagine we succeed in this. We start to succeed at least in this. But then all of a sudden it comes back, hits us harder than before, becomes uncontrollable. We can't stop a flood of imaginings, of daydreaming. So this is what Gurdjieff is pointing out. Discernible bias, even in the beginning, even when we're involved in these try-to tasks. Why? If we take daydreaming and imagination, clearly the reason why, and Gurdjieff is pointing this out, that daydreaming and imagination, we have these in ourselves because they, in our abnormal psychology, perform a function. They're transforming energies in us in some way unknown to us. They're providing us with perhaps the psychological shocks that we should have, that we require to transform energies in ourselves, to maintain ourselves. And if we stop daydreaming and imagination, or try to stop daydreaming and imagination, we stop producing the energies we should have. We require the energies we need. We don't transform the energies we should, because we're not daydreaming and we're not using our imagination. And so these things come back and hit us because we actually need these energies desperately. The energies that are produced by this abnormal, albeit abnormal activities, these abnormal activities of daydreaming and imagination. So these hit us again for this reason. So we discern this pattern from the try-to exercises. We think we're succeeding, but then all of a sudden everything goes out of control and we end up in a worse situation than we started. The reason is that everything that we do is necessary for us as we are. This is the psychology. It's an effect, an abnormal effect of a structural situation that we are in. So Gurdjieff is pointing back again and again in as many different ways as he can to the structural situation, man the machine. It's not that there's something wrong with us, that we have to use daydreaming and imagination. It's not that there's something wrong with us, that we have to think and try to stop thoughts. It's not that there's something wrong with us, that we can't observe ourselves. It's an abnormal psychology, yes, but it is our means of adapting to the fact that the machine doesn't work as it should. It's not the psychology, it's the machine, the structures. We've fallen into structures from which we can't emerge. And in consequence of this, we have an abnormal psychology. And adapting to this situation, we have an abnormal psychology. So we're not dealing with the abnormal psychology because that's a consequence. If we try to change that, as Gurdjieff says, because it's a consequence, even if we change our abnormal psychology ever so slightly, it just reverts back to what it was. Because the cause, the structural situation, the energetic situation remains the same. So, there is a contradiction between the Gurdjieff tradition and Gurdjieff's own teaching. Absolute contradiction. Gurdjieff says we can't develop in any way in the course of our lives. Why not? Because we've fallen into structural situations. Because of our low energetic state, we've fallen into structural situations from which we can't emerge. These have consequences which are psychological consequences. And Gurdjieff is pointing out the psychological abnormalities in us, not our fault, which are a consequence of the situation that we're in. The machine doesn't work as it should. This is what Gurdjieff says to Ouspensky again and again. And we adapt to this by creating in ourselves an abnormal psychology. Now, we can't change the psychology by psychological means because it's a consequence. This is what Gurdjieff is saying, and this is very, very difficult for people brought up to believe that psychologically they can do anything they want. It's very difficult for people brought up in that way to understand what Gurdjieff is actually saying. So, Gurdjieff's teaching is we've fallen to such a low energetic level that we are internally trapped in structures from which we cannot emerge. We don't have the energies to do this. So Gurdjieff's teaching is an energetic teaching, nothing to do with psychology. We must raise the whole energetic level of the organism, of us, of ourselves, to a new level at which we can emerge from these structures, in which case our abnormal psychology will gradually transform itself, virtually, into a normal psychology. We're not working on psychology. So the contradiction that exists there is Gurdjieff is saying we can't change, we can't develop in any way in the course of our lives because any attempt to develop ourselves is a psychological effort. We can't develop by psychological means. We have to develop by energetic means. And this involves a complete rethink of the whole situation. Why have we fallen to such a low energetic level that we are trapped in these internal structures? And hence, in consequence, have an abnormal psychology. What's wrong with the machine? And Gurdjieff gives us his answer. It's not the same answer as the Gurdjieff tradition. So again, we have a contradiction.